A ride of innocence. The late afternoon sun painted the neighborhood in a warm golden glow, casting long shadows across the street as Amara pedaled down the quiet road. The breeze was soft, whispering through the trees that lined the sidewalks. At 14 years old, Amara felt a rare sense of freedom, her new bicycle carrying her swiftly down the path she had ridden so many times before. The bike was sleek, its silver frame shining in the fading light, a gift from her father after months of saving up. She had long dreamed of owning such a bike, one that would not only be a symbol of his love, but a reminder of the sacrifices he made for her. For Amara, this was more than just a bike. It was the realization of a dream, the fulfillment of a promise her father had made. Her heart swelled with pride and happiness as she felt the wind in her hair, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. There was a thrill in every turn of the pedal, in every rush of air against her face that made her feel alive, vibrant, and free. Amara had always been a dreamer, someone who believed in the small joys of life, a shared moment with friends, a beautiful sunset, or the feeling of a bike ride on a perfect afternoon. The simple things. That's why, when she was gifted the bike, it felt like the world had opened up in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the bike. It was her father's love, and the fact that, despite the hardships they'd faced together, he had kept his promise. As she approached the park, where her friends awaited her for their weekly basketball game, Amara's thoughts filled with the excitement of the game. The bike wasn't just a mode of transport. It was an extension of her, a tool for her to explore her neighborhood, clear her mind, or simply enjoy the freedom she was beginning to appreciate. She imagined the game ahead, her friends' laughter, the competition, the thrill of scoring a basket. But as she turned the corner onto a quieter street, the warm glow of the sun and the carefree atmosphere of her ride began to shift. The peaceful solitude was broken by the appearance of a police officer standing on the sidewalk. At first, Amara didn't notice him. It wasn't until she was just a few feet away that his presence hit her. The uniform, the dark sunglasses, the way his posture was rigid and purposeful, all of it made Amara feel uneasy. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the officer's eyes that studied her too intently, scanning not just the shiny new bike, but her as well. Amara's instincts told her something was off. She slowed her pace and brought the bike to a stop, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze on her. The officer didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, his boots tapping against the pavement as he took a few slow steps toward her. Each step was deliberate, heavy, and Amara's heart skipped a beat. She'd never had a bad experience with law enforcement before, but in that moment, she felt as though the officer's gaze was piercing, judging, almost accusing. Her breath caught in her throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, almost harsh, and it sent a chill down her spine. "Where'd you get the bike?" he asked. Amara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. It wasn't the usual greeting or polite inquiry she would have expected from a law enforcement officer. It was a demand. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. The officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as they flicked over the bike. "Where did you get it?" he repeated, his voice carrying an edge. "You look a little young to be riding something like that." Confusion filled Amara's mind. She wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't the type of encounter she had ever imagined. She had worked hard for this bike, and her father had made sure she knew how much he cared. But this officer wasn't concerned with that. His tone implied suspicion, as if she had done something wrong, and she couldn't figure out why. "It's a gift from my dad," she said cautiously, hoping that would diffuse the tension. "He saved up to buy it for me." For a brief moment, the officer's eyes flickered with something like doubt, but it quickly hardened again. A gift. His voice dripped with skepticism. From who? He didn't wait for her to respond before continuing, his questions relentless, as if searching for a hidden truth he was sure lay behind the surface. Amara's stomach tightened, a knot of anxiety forming. She felt exposed, as though she had to justify every part of her existence. Why was he questioning her like this? She was just a girl riding her new bike on a quiet street, enjoying the simple pleasure of the afternoon. "Why are you in such a hurry?" he demanded next, his voice rising in volume. "Where are you going? Why did you choose this street?" Amara's mind raced. Was she being accused of something? She didn't understand. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been enjoying her day. But now she felt trapped, as if every movement she made was being scrutinized. She didn't know what to do. How was she supposed to explain herself when she hadn't done anything? "I'm just going to the park," Amara replied, her voice trembling slightly. She was trying to keep calm, but the officer's interrogation was starting to make her feel small, like she was a suspect in a crime she didn't even know about. "I'm meeting my friends. We're going to play basketball." The officer didn't immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on her, scanning her with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. He seemed to be weighing her words, trying to decide if he believed her. Amara's heart pounded in her chest, the tension making it hard to breathe. She didn't know how much longer she could stand there, under the officer's unrelenting gaze, without saying something wrong. And then, without warning, the officer stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. Amara flinched instinctively, the shock of his touch sending a jolt of panic through her. She pulled back, but his grip tightened. "Hey, let go of me," she exclaimed, her voice rising in a mixture of fear and anger. But the officer wasn't letting go. His fingers dug into her wrist, and she felt a surge of panic as he tightened his hold. She tried to twist her arm free, but it was no use. His grip was like iron. "I'm taking you in for questioning," he muttered under his breath, his voice threatening. Amara's heart raced, her mind spinning. What had just happened? This was not supposed to happen. She was just a kid. She hadn't done anything wrong. She tried to pull away, but the officer's strength was overwhelming. Fear gnawed at her insides, but she was frozen, unsure how to get out of this situation. Her father was always there when things got tough, but he wasn't here now. What could she do? Then, suddenly, a voice broke through the tense silence, a voice that was steady, commanding, and unmistakable. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The officer froze, his grip loosening on Amara's arm. She turned, her confusion mounting, only to see the tall figure of her father approaching. His eyes were locked on the officer with an intensity that made Amara's heart skip a beat. Her father, James Morgan, was an FBI agent, one of the best in his field. And in that moment, Amara realized something. She wasn't alone. The unseen authority. Amara's breath hitched as she saw her father stride down the street toward her. His presence filled the space, exuding an undeniable calmness that immediately seemed to challenge the officer's aggressive demeanor. James Morgan had always carried himself with a quiet authority, an unspoken power that came from years of dedication to his work and an unshakable belief in justice. To Amara, he was her protector, her anchor, the one person who could turn any situation around. The officer, still gripping her wrist, seemed to pause for a moment, clearly caught off guard by the arrival of the man approaching with such unwavering confidence. Amara felt a strange wave of relief wash over her, mixed with an odd sense of pride. She knew her father could handle whatever was coming next. She had seen him deal with criminals, high-stakes investigations, and dangerous situations, but this felt different. This was personal. As her father drew closer, his pace never faltering, the officer hesitated. His eyes darted between Amara and James, his fingers loosening their grip, and his posture shifted from authoritative to uncertain. The change was palpable, as if the officer had suddenly realized he was no longer in control. For a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to hang in the air, an unspoken understanding passing between father and daughter. Amara's chest tightened. She wanted to say something, to tell her father everything, but the words stuck in her throat. James stopped just a few feet away from them. His eyes locked onto the officer's, not with anger, but with the quiet, steady resolve that always made people take notice. His presence was magnetic, and in that moment, the officer seemed to shrink under his gaze. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his voice low, controlled, but undeniably authoritative. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His tone carried weight, one that demanded respect without needing to raise his voice. Amara could see the officer's shoulders tighten, as if he had just realized who he was standing in front of. The officer stammered, his bravado crumbling like a sandcastle under the pressure of James's calm. I was just questioning this young lady," he said, his voice faltering. "She seemed suspicious, riding such an expensive bike. I thought maybe it was stolen." The officer's words hung in the air, their absurdity almost comical if it weren't for the way they had been directed at Amara, a 14-year-old girl simply out for a ride. Amara's stomach twisted as she realized how easily her day had spiraled from something simple and joyful into something dark and confusing. She wasn't just a girl enjoying a bike ride. She was a target. Suspicion. Stolen bike. The accusation stung, and for a moment, she wished she could just disappear. But her father's presence, his unshakable composure, gave her strength. She didn't need to explain herself. He would do that for her. James's gaze never wavered as he processed the officer's words. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing with disbelief. "Suspicious," he repeated, the word almost dripping with incredulity. "A 14-year-old girl riding her bike down the street is suspicious." The officer hesitated, clearly thrown off by the question, unsure how to respond. Amara could feel the shift in the air. The power had shifted from the officer to her father. She was no longer the one being questioned. The officer was now the one under scrutiny. "I didn't mean to escalate things, sir," the officer muttered, his voice growing smaller. "But with everything that's been going on these days, you know, people are on edge. We have to be cautious." James didn't move an inch, his eyes fixed on the officer's face with quiet intensity. "With everything going on these days," he repeated slowly, his voice laced with a calm authority that made the officer take a half step back. "You're supposed to protect people, officer, not bully them, not harass them for enjoying a simple pleasure like riding a bike." Amara stood frozen, watching her father as he spoke. She had heard him say words like this before, when he was standing in courtrooms or briefing his colleagues in the FBI. But hearing it now, in this moment, it felt different. Her father wasn't just an agent of justice, he was her protector. And in that moment, she felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. No longer would she be made to feel small. Her father had stepped in, and everything felt safe again. The officer shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly unsure of what to do next. Amara could see the tension in his face, the realization that he had made a mistake, that he had wrongly accused her, was slowly dawning on him. His shoulders slumped as he tried to come up with an explanation, but nothing he said could erase the sting of his earlier words. I'm sorry, sir," the officer muttered, his voice much quieter now. He looked embarrassed, almost like a child caught in the wrong. "I didn't know." James's gaze didn't soften, but his tone was measured. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice calm but firm. "No, you didn't, but now you do. And that's the point. You don't make assumptions, especially not about a child." The officer nodded mutely, his face flushed with shame. He didn't speak again, his gaze dropping to the ground as if trying to make himself as small as possible. Amara could see the discomfort in his posture, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides, as though he wished he could disappear into the ground beneath him. There was a long pause, filled only with the sounds of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, after a moment that felt like an eternity, James turned to Amara. His gaze softened, and for the first time since the officer had arrived, he looked at her with a tenderness that melted away the last of her fear. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice now gentle, filled with concern. Amara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't know how to put into words what she was feeling. Relief, yes, but also confusion. The encounter had shaken her more than she realized. "Yeah, I'm okay," she whispered, though the words felt too small for what she was experiencing. James reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, a small but reassuring gesture. "Let's go home, kiddo," he said, his voice calm, yet resolute. Before they could turn away, however, the officer spoke again, his voice filled with genuine regret. "I really am sorry," he said, his tone apologetic. "I let my assumptions get the best of me. I didn't mean to cause any harm." James regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he responded. "Assumptions can be dangerous," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "In our line of work, we're taught to question everything. But we're also taught to seek the truth. And when the facts aren't clear, we don't jump to conclusions." The officer nodded, visibly chastened. Amara could see the weight of his apology, but she also knew that words alone couldn't fix what had happened. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something systemic. The officer had made her feel like a criminal for no reason other than his own assumptions. And that was something that couldn't be easily fixed with an apology. James's eyes locked onto the officer's once more, his tone dropping to something quieter, but no less serious. "Next time you find yourself in a situation like this, officer," he said slowly, "don't just look at the surface. Don't just make assumptions about people because of how they look or where they come from. Look for the facts. Understand the situation. And always treat people with respect." Amara felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. Part of her wanted to walk away from the officer without another word, to put the whole incident behind her. But another part of her, the part that had seen the officer's discomfort, wanted to make sure that this lesson wasn't forgotten. It wasn't just about the bike or her father's reputation. It was about standing up for what was right. With a final, long look at the officer, James turned back to Amara. "Let's go home," he said softly, as they began walking away. As they walked side by side, Amara couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. She was shaken, but she was also beginning to understand something important. Sometimes the world wasn't fair. But that didn't mean she had to stay silent. She had a voice. She had her father. And that, more than anything, made her feel strong. A father's wisdom. The walk home felt slower than usual, the quiet weight of what had just happened lingering in the air between them. Amara and her father moved side by side, but it felt as if there were a slight distance between them, the kind that wasn't physical but emotional. Amara tried to process everything that had unfolded. The officer's hostile interrogation, her father's commanding presence, the apology from the officer that didn't quite erase the sting. There were so many emotions swirling in her mind. Confusion, anger, relief, but most of all, there was the sudden realization that her world wasn't as simple as it used to be. She hadn't been naive before. She had grown up hearing stories, seeing the news, and understanding that things weren't always fair. But this was different. She had lived it. She had felt it firsthand. And no matter how hard she tried to shake off the feeling, it kept coming back. The officer hadn't seen her as Amara, a young girl who loved riding her bike or playing basketball with her friends. He hadn't seen her for who she truly was. He had seen a stereotype. He had seen a black girl with a new bike. And that was all he needed to make his assumptions. It was a feeling she couldn't quite put into words, this heaviness in her chest, but her father's presence beside her offered a strange comfort. He had handled the situation so smoothly, so effortlessly, but Amara knew there was more to it. Her father wasn't just any man. He was an FBI agent, someone who dealt with complicated cases, high-profile criminals, and intricate investigations every day. But he wasn't just defined by his career. To Amara, he was something more. He was a protector, a source of wisdom, a man who had been teaching her, guiding her, even when she didn't fully understand. "Dad," Amara said hesitantly, breaking the silence. What do you think really happened back there? I mean, why did he treat me like that?" James didn't look at her immediately. His eyes were forward, his gaze steady as he continued walking. He took a slow breath, clearly weighing his words. He had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to personal matters. But Amara knew him well enough to understand that when he did speak, it was always thoughtful, calculated. He glanced down at her, his expression softening. "You know, sweetheart," he began, his voice low, "sometimes people see things and make snap judgments. They don't always stop to think about the bigger picture. It's easier for some people to assume that something's wrong, something's out of place, just because it doesn't fit into their narrow view of the world." Amara was quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. It wasn't the first time she had heard something like this, but today, hearing it from her father, it felt different. She wanted to understand. She needed to. "But I wasn't doing anything wrong," she said softly. "I was just riding my bike to the park. I didn't do anything wrong. Why did he treat me like that? Like I was a criminal or something?" James paused, his pace slowing for a moment as if he was carefully considering how to respond. "Because, baby, sometimes people don't see what's really in front of them," he said, his tone still calm but with an underlying sadness. "They see a young black girl, maybe a stereotype they've carried with them for too long, and they don't take the time to really look. To see the truth." Amara felt a lump form in her throat as she realized the depth of what her father was saying. She wasn't just a girl on a bike. She wasn't just Amara, the girl who loved basketball and hanging out with her friends. To some people, she was a threat. To some people, her innocence didn't matter, her joy didn't matter. All they saw was the color of her skin and the assumption that she didn't belong. "But that's not fair," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to live in a world like that. I don't want to be treated like I'm guilty for just existing. I don't want to always have to explain myself." James stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression soft but firm. "I know, kiddo," he said gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I wish the world wasn't like that too. But the truth is, there will always be people who judge you based on what they think they know, not what they actually know. And it's not right. But it's something you'll have to face. But I'm here, and I'll always stand by you." Amara looked up at her father, her chest tightening. His words were comforting, but they also made her angry. Why should she have to deal with this? Why should anyone? It wasn't just about her. It was about the world, the injustices that her father had fought so hard against in his work, the things he had witnessed that she would never fully understand. "Is that why you became an FBI agent?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To fight against things like this? To fight for justice?" James's eyes softened as he regarded her, his hand still resting gently on her shoulder. "I became an FBI agent because I believe in justice," he said. "I believe in doing what's right, even when it's hard. But I didn't become an agent just to fight crime. I became one to help people, to make sure that when people are wronged, they have someone who will stand up for them. And that's what I'll do for you, always." Amara felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She had always known her father was special, but hearing him speak like this, so resolute in his purpose, made her realize just how much strength he carried with him every day. He wasn't just her father. He was a man who had seen the worst of the world and still believed in the possibility of change. "But what if it doesn't work?" Amara asked, her voice shaking slightly. "What if we can't change things? What if it's always like this?" Her father smiled gently, the corners of his eyes crinkling as he looked down at her. "You don't change the world all at once. You change it one step at a time, one person at a time. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, Amara, but you do have a voice. You do have power, and you can use it. You don't have to let anyone make you feel small. Not now, not ever." Amara nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of strength light up inside her. It wasn't enough just to be angry or frustrated. She couldn't let those emotions control her. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, for the ones who had been silenced and oppressed. She had to find her voice, and she had to use it. They continued walking, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air between them, but there was a sense of calm now, a feeling that, no matter what, they would face whatever came together. Her father had taught her so many lessons over the years, but today, the lesson was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, and the world wasn't always fair. But she had a choice. She had the power to make a difference, to stand firm in her truth, even when others didn't understand it. And with her father by her side, Amara knew she could face whatever came next. The moment of reckoning. The next few days after the encounter with the officer were a blur for Amara. The sun was still shining brightly, casting its warm light across the neighborhood, but the sense of peace she once felt in these familiar streets seemed to be missing. Her bike ride had turned into an unexpected reminder of the world she was beginning to understand more deeply. The world wasn't as simple as it had once seemed, and despite the comfort her father's presence had given her in that moment, something still gnawed at her. The officer's words, his assumptions, the way he had treated her, all of it replayed in her mind like a broken record. The questions kept coming. Why had he treated her that way? Why had he assumed the worst of her? Amara found herself retreating into herself, unsure of how to process everything. At school, her friends noticed the change. She wasn't as talkative, wasn't as eager to share the excitement of the games they would plan after school. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Even when she rode her bike, the wind no longer felt like the same sense of freedom. It felt more like a fleeting escape from the heaviness in her chest. But it wasn't just her mind that was in turmoil. Her father, James, had returned to his work with the FBI, and Amara noticed a change in him as well. He was quieter at home, more preoccupied. She had always admired the way he carried himself, but now she saw a layer to his presence that she hadn't before. There was an underlying weight to his actions, an understanding that the world outside their small home was full of things he couldn't always protect her from. One evening, just after dinner, as they sat together in the living room, Amara finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since that day with the officer. "Dad," she said, her voice tentative. James, who had been sitting with a file in his lap, looked up at her, his expression calm but alert. "What happens now?" "With the officer, do you think he's going to face any consequences for what he did?" James set the file down slowly, his gaze unwavering as he turned his full attention to her. Amara could see the internal struggle in his eyes, the conflict between being the father she knew and the man who had lived through the complexities of the justice system. He exhaled deeply before answering, his voice steady but with an edge of caution. "That's a good question," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "but it's not as simple as you might think." Amara's brow furrowed, her eyes searching his face. "But he treated me like a criminal. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, sweetheart," James said softly. "And you're right. What happened to you was wrong. But the question isn't just about what happened in that moment. It's about what happens next, how the system reacts, and whether the right people hold the officer accountable." Amara felt a knot in her stomach. She had always believed that the system would work, that justice would prevail when it needed to. But now she wasn't so sure. "So you think he might get away with it?" James's eyes softened as he met her gaze. "There's always a chance that things won't play out the way they should. People can be held accountable, but sometimes it takes more than just the truth to make that happen. It's not always fair, and that's something you're going to have to accept. But it doesn't mean we stay silent. It doesn't mean we let it go." Amara remained silent, letting her father's words settle in her mind. What did he mean by that? The officer had made a mistake, a big one. He had treated her as though she were guilty before even knowing the truth. Could someone like him really just walk away without any consequences? But her father wasn't one to back down. She knew that. He didn't let things go when they weren't right. and that gave her a flicker of hope. James leaned forward slightly, his eyes hardening with a newfound intensity. "Listen, Amara," he said, his voice lowering to a more serious tone. "I know you don't want to hear this, but sometimes things don't change overnight, and that officer might not face immediate consequences for his actions. But that doesn't mean this is the end of the story. This is where we step in and make sure he understands that what he did was wrong, and that it can't happen again." Amara felt a surge of anger at the thought of the officer getting away with his behavior. But then, her father's words shifted the way she viewed the situation. This wasn't just about the officer. This was about something bigger. It was about making sure the system worked. It was about fighting for what was right, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. "So, you're going to do something about it?" Amara asked, her voice small but determined. "You're going to make sure he doesn't just get away with it?" James nodded slowly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Yes, but I can't do it alone. This is something you need to be a part of too. You're the one who was wronged, Amara. You're the one who can make your voice heard." Amara felt a mix of pride and apprehension wash over her. She had always admired her father's resolve, his ability to fight for what was right, no matter how difficult it seemed. But now, for the first time, she realized that she, too, had a role to play in this. She couldn't just stand by and let it slide. She had to stand up, to speak her truth, no matter how uncomfortable or uncertain it might feel. "But what if they don't listen to me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What if they just think I'm overreacting?" "They might," James said quietly. "People will try to discredit you. They'll try to make you feel like you're the problem. But you have to remember one thing. Your story matters. Your truth matters. And I'll make sure it's heard. I promise you that." Amara felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her father. He had always been there for her, guiding her, protecting her. But now she realized that the fight wasn't just his. It was theirs. She had to be part of this, even if it meant facing something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The next day, James took Amara to his office in the FBI headquarters. She had been to his office before, but this time, there was a different air about it. She felt like she was walking into a world that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. As they entered the building, the familiar hum of activity around them felt less like background noise and more like the heartbeat of a system she was now learning to understand. Amara had always admired the way her father carried himself in this environment. His confident, calm demeanor, the way people respected him. But today, as they walked into his office, she noticed something new in the way he spoke to his colleagues, the way he moved with purpose. It wasn't just about the work he did. It was about something much more. It was about integrity, about standing up for the things that mattered. Once they were seated in his office, James turned to Amara with a serious expression. "I've already started the process of reporting the officer's actions, Amara," he said. "But it's important that you understand something. This isn't just about us. It's about holding the system accountable. It's about making sure that people who are supposed to protect others don't use their power in ways that harm innocent people." Amara nodded, a new sense of purpose building inside her. She understood now. This wasn't just about her. This was bigger. This was about the future. And she was ready to be a part of it. The power of truth. The days following their visit to the FBI office were both uneventful and tumultuous for Amara. There was a strange kind of stillness in her life. On the surface, everything seemed normal. She still rode her bike, met with her friends at the park, and went through her usual school routine. But beneath the surface, her world was shifting. Every time she pedaled down the street, the weight of that encounter with the officer hung over her. The questions her father had posed to her about standing up for what was right had planted seeds in her mind, and now they were growing into something deeper, something stronger. It had been nearly a week since the incident, and James had kept his promise. He had reported the officer's actions, but things weren't as simple as Amara had hoped. It wasn't just about filling out a report and hoping for the best. The bureaucracy of it all was slow, meticulous, and often frustrating. But her father wasn't one to back down. He had a way of turning even the most mundane tasks into opportunities to fight for what was right. And now, that fight was becoming Amara's too. It started with small things. Her father had requested meetings with internal affairs and had taken steps to ensure that the officer involved was properly investigated. He wasn't expecting instant results, but he was determined to push the issue. Amara began to understand what her father had meant when he said that justice wasn't something that happened by accident. It was something you fought for every single day. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Amara couldn't help but feel the pressure building in her chest. Her father's presence had given her strength, but now that she was stepping into this larger conversation, she realized the magnitude of it all. It wasn't just about one officer, one encounter. It was about a system that needed to change, a system that sometimes failed to see the humanity of the people it was supposed to protect. "Dad, have you heard anything about what's happening with the officer?" Amara asked, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. James paused mid-bite, his eyes meeting hers with the same steady gaze he always carried. "I have," he said, setting his fork down. "There's an ongoing investigation. Internal Affairs has launched a review of the officer's actions. It's not fast, but it's happening." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for something more immediate, more concrete. But she knew her father had never promised quick fixes. Still, the thought of waiting, of knowing that there were others out there who could experience the same thing, made her uneasy. "Is it going to be enough?" Amara asked, her words soft but full of meaning. "Will it really make a difference?" James looked at her with a thoughtful expression, his eyes lingering on hers as though weighing the gravity of her question. "I hope so," he said finally. "But the thing about justice, Amara, is that it's not always clear-cut. You have to trust that the right people are doing the right things. And sometimes that takes time. It's frustrating, but it's important." Amara nodded, feeling the weight of her father's words. She had always been taught to believe in justice, but now she saw that it wasn't just about right and wrong. It was about people making choices, about systems that sometimes failed to protect those who needed it most. And that was something that needed to be fixed, not just once, but over and over again. Her mind returned to the officer, the man who had accused her of stealing her own bike. The idea that he could continue to be in a position of authority, that he could keep doing his job while treating innocent people with suspicion and hostility, made Amara's blood boil. She had always believed in the idea of fairness, but now she realized that fairness didn't come automatically. You had to make it happen. As the days passed, Amara continued to reflect on her role in all of this. She had spoken up when the officer had wrongfully grabbed her arm, had told him that he was in the wrong. But was that enough? Was it enough to stand up for herself in that moment, or was there more she could do? Her father had given her the tools to fight for what was right, but the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. One afternoon, as she was walking home from school, Amara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her father. He had forwarded her an email from Internal Affairs with the subject line, "Investigation Update." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The message was brief, but the contents made her heart race. The officer involved in the incident had been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his actions. It wasn't a final decision, but it was a step. A big one. Amara smiled to herself, a small spark of hope lighting up inside her. This was real. Her father's work, their work, was making a difference. The officer's actions had been questioned, and now there was a chance that accountability would be pursued. But as Amara walked toward home, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that had been with her since that day. The knowledge that there was still much more to be done. Accountability was important, but it wasn't enough. It had to be part of a larger conversation, a shift in the way society viewed people like her, a change in the way young black girls were seen, not as threats, but as people deserving of respect and dignity. That night after dinner, As they sat together in the living room, Amara turned to her father. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with the weight of what was to come. James looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of understanding. "Now, Amara," he said softly, "we continue. We keep fighting. We make sure that no one else has to go through what you did. We make sure that every person, no matter their age, no matter their skin color, is treated with the respect they deserve." Amara felt the power of his words settle into her chest. She wasn't alone in this fight. She had her father's strength, but more than that, she had her own. The power of truth, the power of standing up, of being heard, would carry her through. And as long as she kept her voice strong, as long as she stood firm in her beliefs, she could make a difference. She could change the world, one step at a time. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the future. It was about a world where justice wasn't just an ideal. It was a reality. And Amara knew that, with her father's guidance and her own courage, she was ready to be part of that change. The ripple effect. Amara stood on the porch one morning, her fingers lightly grasping the handlebars of her bike. The sun was rising, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. She took a deep breath, the fresh morning air filling her lungs. Everything seemed calm, yet she felt a sense of anticipation building inside her. There was a quiet intensity that had settled within her ever since the officer had been placed on administrative leave. The journey her father had started, the battle for justice, was far from over, and Amara had come to understand that she was an integral part of it. This wasn't just about her, it was about something larger. She had been the one targeted by the officer, but her story was just one among many. There were countless other people, other kids who had experienced the same type of suspicion, the same type of treatment. Amara was starting to see the pattern, starting to realize that what had happened to her wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger issue, one that she couldn't ignore anymore. She thought about her conversation with her father the night before. They had talked about the progress of the investigation into the officer's actions, and though things were moving, it was clear that they weren't the only ones who cared. More voices were joining in, and more people were speaking up about the injustices they had witnessed. Her father had been instrumental in ensuring that the officer was being held accountable, but Amara now understood that this wasn't just about one person. This was about the whole system. The world was beginning to change, but it was a slow and difficult process. The systemic issues that had shaped the way people were treated didn't vanish overnight. Amara realized that even with her father's influence, the fight for fairness and equality wasn't easy. The truth was that it would take more than just one report, more than one act of standing up. It would take a collective effort to make sure the world started seeing people for who they really were, not just as stereotypes or assumptions. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the familiar sound of her father's car pulling into the driveway. He was home earlier than usual, and Amara couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. Her father had been working tirelessly on the investigation, and she knew that today there was something different in the air. She was certain of it. As James stepped out of the car and walked up the steps toward her, his face was serious but with a glimmer of something else, something hopeful. He stopped just in front of Amara, his gaze softening as he noticed the way she was holding the bike. "You ready for a ride?" he asked with a smile, his voice light but laden with meaning. Amara nodded, though she could feel her heart beating faster. "I was just thinking about everything," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "About how this is bigger than just me. I mean, what if it's not just the officer? What if it's the whole system?" Her father gave her a knowing look, one that Amara recognized as his serious mode. He took a deep breath and stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're right," he said slowly, his voice grave yet reassuring. "This isn't just about that officer. It's about the systems that protect people like him. The systems that often fail people like you. But we're making progress, Amara. Every step we take, every person we bring into this fight, we're chipping away at it. And soon, things will change." Amara's eyes widened slightly, trying to process what her father was saying. So, we're really doing something. James's eyes softened as he nodded. Yes, sweetheart. It's real. You're making a difference. With that, Amara felt a rush of emotions. Relief, hope, but also something deeper. Pride. She had known that her father was doing everything he could to ensure that the officer was held accountable, but now she understood just how important her role was in this fight for justice. Her voice, her story, it all mattered. The ripple effect of standing up for what was right was beginning to take shape, and Amara realized that she wasn't just part of her own story, she was part of something much bigger. As they both mounted their bikes and set off down the street, Amara's mind raced with all the possibilities. Her father had always been her role model, someone who inspired her with his unwavering belief in justice and his ability to fight for it. But now, Amara felt herself stepping into those shoes. She was finding her own voice, learning that the truth mattered, and that even as a young girl, she had the power to make people listen. Over the following weeks, Amara found herself more engaged in conversations with her father about the investigation. They discussed the progress being made, the setbacks, and the long road ahead. But she was also hearing from others, her friends at school, her neighbors, and even strangers who had been touched by her story. The ripple effect had begun. People were speaking out, sharing their own experiences, and demanding change. The officer was still under review, but the wider conversation was growing, and Amara realized how powerful it was to have so many voices united in the pursuit of justice. One afternoon, a news story broke about the officer involved in her case. The headline was simple but striking. Officer suspended amidst investigation into misconduct. Amara felt her heart race as she read through the article, which outlined the officer's actions and the ongoing internal review. There was even a statement from the police department acknowledging the need for better training in how officers interacted with young people. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start. The system was beginning to acknowledge the problem. She immediately sent the article to her father, and within minutes he called her. His voice, though calm, was filled with a pride she had never heard before. "You did this, Amara. You helped make this happen." Amara felt a lump form in her throat as she tried to hold back the tears. She hadn't done it alone. She had her father's strength, his wisdom, and his guidance. But now she realized that she was standing on her own. She had found her voice, and it was being heard. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into the officer continued. But Amara's life, her perspective, had already changed. She no longer saw herself as a passive participant in a world that often seemed indifferent to her struggles. She was an active force, someone who could influence the way things unfolded. The ride that had once symbolized freedom had become a symbol of her strength, her resilience, and her belief that justice would eventually prevail. And as she pedaled down the streets once again, her bike no longer felt like just an escape from the world. It felt like a tool for change. The world was still flawed, still full of challenges, but Amara was beginning to believe that one person's voice could indeed make a difference. She had seen the ripple effect begin, and now she was ready to keep pushing, to make waves of change that would spread beyond her own story.